Okay, thank you so much, everybody, for being here. My name is Susan Church, and I work for the Office for Refugees and Immigrants. The first thing we're going to discuss is the Department of Homeland Security and the way it is structured. People talk about immigration this and immigration that, but it's actually a large number of different federal agencies rolled into a topic that they cover, which is immigration-related issues. First is Immigration and Customs Enforcement. You may have all heard of Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE, as they are often referred to on TV. They are certainly the individuals that you see with the blue jackets on TV, and the back of their jacket often says ICE or Federal Police or Police. Doesn't always say ICE. But ICE also has a number of other agencies that are intimately involved with the work that they do, which is all law enforcement based. One of those agencies is called HSI, or Homeland Security Investigations. They don't do a lot of the day-to-day enforcement, but they do like really deep dives on particular cases. So an example is there was a case involving the Rwandan genocide, and HSI was the investigatory team on that case. But ICE is also the prosecutors in immigration court. So as people are sitting in immigration court with the immigration judge in front of them, there's the immigration lawyer or the immigrant themselves if they don't have a lawyer. And the other side is ICE prosecutors who are lawyers. They're clearly a law enforcement agency, and that is their goal. Similarly, there is another agency called Customs and Border Protection. You might have had contact with Customs and Border Protection, or CBP, as we call them, when you flew in or out of the country. When you fly back into the country, there are those people in blue uniforms and the big glass booths as you're coming in with your passport. That's CBP. But CBP is also another agency that you've probably seen on TV called Border Patrol. They are in the white vans with the green lettering. They physically patrol the border, like going up and down the southern and northern border. The Coast Guard controls the coast. And they wear green and tan uniforms. Customs and Border Patrol, or CBP, has the legal authority to conduct enforcement anywhere in the United States within 100 miles of the border. What is that border? That is the northern border, Canada, the southern border, Mexico, and it is both the Pacific and Atlantic Ocean. So that means that both sides of the country, including Massachusetts, Vermont, and New Hampshire, are all within 100 miles of that border. What that looked like under the last Trump administration was random checkpoints, particularly in Vermont and New Hampshire, where families would be going away on vacation and maybe camping, maybe to go hiking, and there would be Border Patrol agents randomly checking identification there. That resulted in arrest, and most of those arrests were deemed legal by the courts when they were challenged. Customs and Border Patrol also has the right to search your telephones, your text messages, your emails, and your laptops when you come into the United States, even if you are a US citizen. So often people think they're US citizens, nobody can look at their data, nobody can look, they have privacy rights, but no one has those privacy rights at the border. Very different from these two agencies is what we call USCIS, or United States Citizenship and Immigration Services. USCIS is a benefits agency. They are there to help people go along in their process of getting legalized in immigration. What they do is they decide whether or not you're eligible for a green card, whether you're eligible for citizenship. Even the visa process before you even come to the United States often starts at USCIS. I wouldn't say that there's no enforcement or law enforcement at USCIS, but what I would describe it as, there's not necessarily a wall between the first two agencies and USCIS, but there's a fence, right? So there's some limits on the way that they act. It's not an enforcement agency, it's a benefits agency. It's paid for by the fees that people pay into the agency. So it's not it's not funded by taxpayers at all. But there is some limited enforcement, and we're going to talk about that. We are constantly getting calls and text messages and emails and videos on TV telling us basically that ICE is everywhere all the time. And it's simply not true. They cannot be everywhere all the time, and they are not. There are limited ways with which ICE can conduct enforcement and limited locations or resources for them to do that with. And what we know, I've been an immigration lawyer for 25 years. What we know is what we've seen in the past, and we expect to see a lot of these same patterns going forward. So how does enforcement happen? First and foremost, not in volume, but in predictability, is immigration individuals who are charged with a criminal offense going to state criminal court, not federal. So there's state law, which is Massachusetts only, and there's federal law, which is the US government, and they're very different. So state criminal court are your local courts. If you get a driving without a license charge, if you get a shoplifting charge, something, you get in a car accident, you don't leave your name and date of birth at the scene of the car accident, all those are state criminal offenses. And you go to state court. We do not see, we see ICE knowing that somebody has been arrested the night before. Let's say you live in Lowell and you forgot that you didn't renew your driver's license, or you're driving on a learner's permit when you should not be, and the Lowell police pull you over. What happens is you get your fingerprints taken by the Lowell police, and those fingerprints are then sent to ICE. It's just not sent to them, but they automatically go to ICE. ICE has access to the system where the fingerprints are taken. ICE then makes a plan, depending on availability of officers, to be at the Lowell court the next day, because they say, okay, this person's undocumented. They are going to court for a criminal charge. I can pick that person up then. So, but what that doesn't mean in the past, and what we haven't seen a lot of in the past, are ICE picking up victims of crimes or witnesses to crimes. And although people certainly are fearful about this, the reason that doesn't happen in the same way as the criminal defendant is they don't get the fingerprint notice of the witness to a crime or the victim to a crime going to court, right? So the reason they pick up the person who got charged with driving without a license is they got their fingerprints. But a victim, boyfriend and girlfriend get into a fight the night before. If the girlfriend goes to court to file for a restraining order, ICE doesn't get her fingerprints, so they don't know she's there. It's not to say nobody would ever be picked up who is a witness or a victim of a crime. It just means it's less common that would happen. We talked before about USCIS and USCIS being a benefits agency. And so there's not the same level of enforcement as there might be as you walked into ICE. But there are limited circumstances where we have seen arrest at USCIS. Probably the most common is where someone has what's called a final order of removal. A final order of removal is where a person has gone through their entire immigration case, like beginning to end. They've lost their case, and because of that, they don't have the right to see the judge. USCIS generally alerts ICE when someone has a removal order, and generally ICE picks that person up. However, we do see some limits on that when there's an actual court case on this in Massachusetts where that person going to USCIS is married to a US citizen. And so there are more protections available when they're married to a US citizen based on a court case. Similarly, for people with criminal charges, generally more serious criminal charges that make them ineligible for the benefit that they are seeking at USCIS, we do see some enforcement of that situation. Our advice is always to speak to a competent immigration attorney before going to USCIS. Similarly, for students and people who are traveling, hold on one second, let me just fix this. We definitely see a significant amount of enforcement. For people who are flying in and out of the country. So, sorry, I'm trying to fix my slide. Give me 1 second.
And while Susan is pulling her slides back up, I just wanted to remind folks that if you do have questions about your own personal situation, or you know someone who does, I did share a resource for legal aid questions. We won't be able to answer any personal questions tonight about people's immigration status, but that's a really great place for you to go and get some help dealing with an issue and speaking to an attorney. So that link is in the chat now, and I'll pass it back to Susan.
Thank you so much. So you also will see, and this is particularly for people who are here on visas, traveling in and out of the United States is absolutely a really easy time for CBP, Customs and Border Patrol, to revoke a visa and rescind a visa, or if you're a green card holder, to put you in deportation proceedings. The reason that is that when you come in and out of the country, CBP is a agency that has access to criminal records, and they also have a whole bunch of internal information, and they look at people's cases quite closely when they come in and out of the country. So for a visa holder, especially a student or somebody who's coming in a visitor, what we see a lot of is somebody who is showing quote unquote immigrant intent. Immigrant intent means that the person coming in on a temporary visitor's visa actually intends to stay in the United States. How does CBP know that? That is where they are looking at your text messages, they're looking at your computer, and in the process of doing that, they are able to determine that maybe you've been in text messaging your boyfriend or your girlfriend and you're very much in love and you're talking about getting married on there. CBP might see that back and forth exchange on your text messages. That makes them suspicious that you're not going to leave the United States, you're going to get married and stay, and that's immigrant intent, and they can rescind your visa. We see that happening to students a lot who are international travel students. Also, fraud is a very common issue. Not so much for green card holders, but visa holders who are working, like they're coming in on a visitor's visa, but they're actually working. We see a lot of what's called expedited removal in that process. That means that CBP can immediately rescind the visa. They don't even have to allow you to see a judge most of the time. So I'm sure many of you think, based on what you're seeing on the news, that ICE is conducting raids left and right every single day. And in Massachusetts, and I'm not speaking for anybody outside of the state, we're honestly not seeing that yet. Hopefully we will never see it. What we are seeing a lot of is targeted enforcement. So raids are where immigration goes into a mall or a random place and just starts checking people IDs, an employment place, something like that, just checking everybody's IDs, and they don't really know who's there. The last raid we have seen in Massachusetts is during the prior President Bush administration, so a really long time ago. What we have seen in Massachusetts and continue to see is targeted enforcement. That is where ICE makes a list of who they need to speak to that day, who they believe are for some reason are deportable, and they go to that person's home or they go to their workplace and they arrest them. We most recently saw, shortly after the president took office, ICE officers walking around the state. They went to East Boston and they went to Market Basket, and they had Fox News cameras following them around. That was made to instill fear into people, but it was pretty consistent with the type of targeted enforcement we've seen throughout every administration. Another area which we expect to see a lot of enforcement around is attending an ICE appointment. So many people under the Obama administration were given what's called a stay of removal or an order of supervision. And they were told, just come back once a year, and as long as everything's okay and you don't have any criminal charges, we'll let you stay. Those stays of removal were most often given to the most kind of heartbreaking cases, people with children with severe developmental disabilities, people with health issues. I had a client who had stage 4 cancer. And so when the Trump administration took over, those individuals would walk into their appointments and ICE would arrest them. Or they would give them a letter that would say you have 60 days to leave the country. That was a very common experience during the last Trump administration. It tended to target the most law-abiding people who would just walk into ICE, and we expect to see that happening again. If you have an ICE appointment coming up, you need to talk to an immigration lawyer, and don't wait till a week before the appointment. Prioritize it now. Responding to an email, text, or letter from ICE, at some point in time, we expect people to start getting text messages saying you have 60 days to leave the country, or a letter saying you have 60 days to leave the country. Those text messages and emails, we expect them, if they do happen, we really highly recommend that you speak to an immigration lawyer before you respond to them. So similar to the fact that enforcement happens generally in kind of targeted ways in systematic locations, very similar to that, we have enforcement, we have grounds of removability that people have. So not everybody can be deported. ICE can't go and pick up a citizen and deport them. ICE can't go and pick up a lawful permanent resident who has no criminal history and deport them. Even a student on a student visa who's followed all the rules of the student visa, ICE doesn't have the authority or the ability to deport that person. What has to happen is the individuals have to fall into a grounds of deportation. There's many different grounds, unfortunately. The book is about this thick and the font is 9 points. However, the number one thing that you would come to mind is an unauthorized or an undocumented immigrant. However, that's not very well defined what that is. There are many people in the United States who maybe they came across the border without permission, but after coming here, they surrendered to Border Patrol. They filed for asylum. They filed for something called a U visa, which is a victim of violent crime, or similar things. So they have papers to show why they are here and what they are pursuing. I would not call that person undocumented. Whether or not they are deportable and protected by whatever papers they filed completely depends on what papers they filed and what their background is and what their history is. Certainly somebody who came in across the border, never surrendered to Border Patrol, and has nothing pending with the government, and doesn't have a visa or another legal grounds to be here, that person would be deportable, right? And that would be somebody that ICE would be targeting. There's also grounds of deportability that don't require a criminal conviction or even charge at all. That is drug trafficker, human trafficker, and false claim to U.S. citizenship. Some people have made false claims to U.S. citizenship by checking a box when they're looking for employment saying that they're a U.S. citizen. And that problem can follow them throughout their entire immigration process and bar them from all sorts of other grounds of eligibility. So it's something to be very careful about. We'll talk a little bit more on the next page about criminal charges for lawful permanent residents, but those can cause somebody to be deportable. It's not a fully permanent green card when there are criminal charges. We talked earlier about what expedited removal looks at the border. And that process also, the Trump administration is trying to get that process going in the United States also. If they are to succeed in that, they've proposed a new regulation. They need to have less than 2 years presence, or so a person needs to be physically present less than 2 years. They need to lack status altogether, meaning they don't have TPS, they don't have asylum pending or anything like that. And they have to not be in removal proceedings, meaning that they're not in front of the immigration judge. The Trump administration is certainly trying to pull people out of removal proceedings. So if they're in front of the judge, to dismiss their cases. So anybody in that situation, especially somebody that's been here less than 2 years, should talk to a lawyer. Finally, and this is really important, if you miss your immigration court hearing, you are subject to immediate mandatory detention and mandatory deportation, where you don't get to see the judge. So going to your immigration court hearing is a really essential part of the process to make sure your status is protected. So we talked a little bit about green card holders and criminal charges of green card holders. Nearly all drug convictions can cause some problem somewhere with green card holders. So what does that look like? Possession of marijuana. That's legal in Massachusetts, but it's not legal under federal law. So if you possess marijuana under 30 grams and let's say you're in Utah where it's still illegal to possess and you get convicted, that might not cause a green card holder to have problems while they're in the United States. But if they leave the United States and come back into the country, what was not even a deportable offense and that they could have gotten citizenship with has now become mandatory detention and mandatory deportation. So again, it's very important for green card holders, visa holders, anybody with a criminal charge to speak to an immigration lawyer before traveling or before applying for any benefit at USCIS. There's a new law called the Laken-Riley Act, and that law has also instituted mandatory detention. Mandatory detention means you don't get to ask the judge for bail. You just are detained and subject to mandatory detention. The Laken-Riley Act expands who can be held under mandatory detention and the charges. So theft, fraud, anything like that, assault and battery on a police officer, almost all of them are going to trigger problems under Laken-Riley Act. For green card holders, there's also problems with domestic violence charges and violations of protective order. Some of the new rules that the government, that the Trump administration proposed is that gang involvement is now the equivalent of terrorism, and that can cause its own immigration problems. Okay, so it's important for everyone to understand that it's not a crime to be in the United States without proper documentation. The only crime is the way you cross the border, and that is a misdemeanor. But many people come to the United States with a visa and just overstay their visa, or they have been paroled into the United States by the prior administration. So there's no issue of them having committed a crime. Everybody has a right to be safe and free from unlawful search and seizure in their homes, subject to a few limited exceptions, which are like exigent emergencies and things like that. That everyone applies to group homes. It applies to shelters. It applies to homeless shelters. It applies to anywhere where you would expect to be a private area or an area that is where you might live or sleep or expect a right of privacy. So it's a kind of a long legal definition. That law comes from the Massachusetts Constitution, the Fourth Amendment, the Massachusetts Declaration of Rights, which is a Massachusetts law, a Massachusetts statute, and there's a case from our Supreme Judicial Court, Commonwealth v. Lunn. It's actually been mentioned in the news lately that specifically says that an ICE detainer is not a valid warrant. And so when you enjoy a right to freedom from search and seizure, It means that somebody needs a judicial warrant in order to enter your home or your private space. And we're going to talk about what that is. What's private versus public? So for schools, if you're thinking about, is my school private or is my school public? We would suggest that most schools are private, unless you are a school that lets anybody from the public come in and out whenever they want. Most schools have sign-in sheets, locked front doors, things like that. And most schools have policies that don't allow general public in at any time. What's the difference between public versus private? So a public area usually is like a sidewalk, a street, a parking lot. It gets a little tricky with schools about outdoor, like sporting events and things like that. Is your sporting event, your football game, only open to members of your school community, or can anybody go, right? That would be the definition of public versus private. Do you have like a curriculum night at your school? That would be probably private because it's only open to the parents of the children there. So that's what you think about when you think of public versus private. I've had a lot of people ask me, well, can I just make my school private? If I want to have a football game or if I want to have this kind of game, can I just put a sign up that says it's private? The answer to that is, probably not. I'm not a privacy expert, but if I go take a sign and I put it on my public street and I say my street is private now, I'm probably not actually making that street private. So you can really use a lot of common sense when thinking about whether your space is public versus private. Is there a sign-in sheet? Is there a locked door? Is there signs that say it's private? And does your area have policies and procedures that mark it as private? We have had a lot of fear surrounding what's called the sensitive locations memo and the Trump administration's withdrawal of the sensitive locations memo. First of all, good news for churches, at least that memo has been reinstated by the courts, or at least the rule protecting churches has been reinstated by the court. That was a lawsuit filed by Democracy Forward. It's really interesting reading. But there used to be a memo. It's called the sensitive locations memo. It was issued by ICE, and it said they won't conduct enforcement at churches, schools, courts, weddings, and other sensitive locations. That was withdrawn on January 24th. However, in Massachusetts, the privacy protections have not been withdrawn because our Constitution and our court cases say that areas that are private and they need a warrant for law enforcement to enter. So just because the sensitive location memo has been withdrawn, there are still protections available for schools that prevent law enforcement from accessing without a warrant. So I talked a lot about judicial warrants. What is a judicial warrant? And they need a judicial warrant. That is because under the rules, if law enforcement is at let's talk about your home and let's talk about your school's front door. So let's talk about your home. If law enforcement is at your home, under the law, first of all, what you need to do is take a deep breath, right? We know it's stressful, but take a deep breath. But under the law, you are allowed to say to an officer at your front door, officer, what is your name? What is your agency ID? Do you have a warrant? And can I see the warrant? That is your right. We don't advise people in this presentation whether they should or should not open the door. And we don't advise people that because different choices have different consequences for different people. There are some immigrants who have been here undocumented for 30 years. Their child has severe autism. They've never committed a crime. If they go to immigration court, there is a pretty good chance that they could go through a procedure called a 10-year green card and come out with a green card. But there's other people who have these removal orders, and if they open the door, they are never going to get to see the judge. They could be removed from the country in 1 or 2 weeks. So what we really strongly advise people to do is if you're worried about ICE coming to your door, the time to make that decision about whether or not you're going to open the door is now by consulting with a competent immigration attorney. So let's say they come to your door and you have decided, I'm not going to open the door for ICE, okay? You have to figure out whether it's actually ICE at your door because you are legally required to open the door for a judicial warrant. And if you don't, you could have a much more bigger problems, which is obstruction of law enforcement, things like that. So how do I know if it's a judicial warrant? First and foremost, you want to look at the warrant yourself. You have to read these warrants carefully. This is on the left is a United States District Court. The word court is there. It has the word warrant on there. And most importantly, it's signed by a judge. So the three indicators of a warrant are: number one, is it issued by a court? Number two, is it signed by a judge? And number three, is it based on probable cause? I wouldn't worry about figuring out the third one, because ICE warrants have probable cause on them also. Another clue that this is a valid judicial warrant and not a warrant from ICE is it says search and seizure here. Very different from the warrant you just saw on the left is the ICE, what is called an ICE warrant. And we call these administrative warrants. You know this is not a court judicial warrant because the first clue says United States Department of Homeland Security. That's not a court. Second, it says warrant for arrest of alien. ICE calls people aliens, but our state courts do not. Third, it would have a signature down here, but that signature says immigration officer, it doesn't say judge. Does not, hold on. This is a state warrant. This looks a little different, but most of them tend to look like this. They're not uniform in that they all look the same. But again, it has search warrant here. It has trial court of Massachusetts over here. It says Superior Court. Courts in Massachusetts are based on county, so there's Superior Court, there's Essex Court, Roxbury, different courts. And there's also district courts, so those are based on different towns. There's Lowell District Court, Waltham District Court, Boston Municipal Court. Those are the different courts that you see. There's a long list. At the bottom of a state warrant is a signature by a judge or justice, clerk, magistrate, or assistant clerk. For schools, the guidance for school has been issued by the Massachusetts Attorney General's office. This is their QR code here. I'm going to just leave it up on the screen a little bit. If you hold your phone up to that QR code, you can actually link directly to the guidance. But it's a really informative document that talks to schools about what their policies and procedures should be with regards to ICE. Generally, the Attorney General's office has great resources regarding equal access to public education for students and upholding the rights of immigrant students. The Attorney General office this is their actual guidance. A lot of schools give us questions about directory information. Generally, their guidance is to limit disclosure of directory information to specific parties, specific purposes, or both, and allow parents or guardians to opt out of directory information. Also limiting the directory information to name, phone number, or grade level, dates of attendance, or participation in activities or awards are a way to keep a much more public directory private. If ICE requests an interview of a student, the Attorney General's office guidance says that the school, because the school is bound by privacy laws, obviously, and they advise the schools to use the phrase, the school cannot confirm nor deny a student's personally identifiable information. If ICE asks you if a student is there, it is really important not to say they're there and not to say they're not there. It's extremely important because you don't want to be in a situation where you're denying that a student is present on your campus, but the student really is. So that's why you just say the school cannot confirm nor deny a student's personally identifiable information. If ICE arrives at your school, they are supposed to be referred to the district's central office and ensure that proper protocol is filed. Each of your schools should have a policy and procedure and a legal counsel that discusses the appropriate response. Allow schools to obtain the specific informed written consent of a parent or guardian. If an agent prevents a judicial warrant, which is the warrant we talked about, or any warrant, the school's legal counsel should confirm that it's judicial versus administrative and make the appropriate decisions. It's also really important for schools to think about plan ahead resources. This is a link to an emergency planning guide for parents with uncertain immigration status. If a family is concerned about somebody not being able to pick their child up at school, they should be advised about making sure there's a list of names of people that the school carries that can legally pick their child up. We also saw a lot of problems with, under the last Trump administration, with parents being deported and the U.S. citizen spouse wanting to take the U.S. citizen child to the original country of the other parent and not having the passport for the child. So this emergency planning guide really does talk about all the different things you can do to prepare for worst case scenario. If you or your school or your location would like to have a smaller presentation that's more intimate with all of the translated materials, you can you can email any of these 2 email addresses or call the Attorney General's office, and they will conduct like a smaller, more intense, I guess is the right word, Know Your Rights presentation. I've said many times on this presentation, please make sure to get an attorney, talk to an attorney. I know how difficult that is because they are expensive or they're hard to find or they have long wait lists. So if you are looking for legal help and you're concerned about your legal status or your students are concerned about their legal status, we just strongly recommend starting now. The top resource is like a statewide legal resource finder. The second list is a list of both lawyers, private lawyers, and nonprofits who do legal services. And then the city of Boston does free 15-minute consultations, and they have a bunch of dates available. Last but not least, there's a national list on the bottom slide. And if we stop recording, I'm available for questions.